Hi everybody, you guys able to hear me okay? Yes, okay, thank you. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So I've got quite a few course logistics things to go through today. So I want to start by mentioning, if you haven't already seen on Canvas, I posted an announcement about this mid-semester feedback survey. So this is a survey so that you can give feedback about the course so far. It's really helpful to me in terms of helping me change anything or adapt things in the course, so that, believe it or not, we're all the way almost to the midpoint of the semester. So for the second half, I can take your feedback into consideration and try to make it a better course for you, and also cover any specific areas that you're interested in. So it's a pretty brief survey. Feel free to answer as much as you want or as little as you want. It is completely anonymous. It's not linked to your name. So I don't know even who participates. So don't hesitate to give critical feedback or anything. So if you haven't done it already, please go and fill out that survey. It will be really helpful for everybody. And I'll probably next class, I'll kind of bring you a summary of all the responses. A lot of people have responded already, or there are a lot of responses already, I should say. But I'll kind of summarize them, and we'll discuss it a little bit next time. So try to complete it before next class if you want to complete it. Okay, so since last time we didn't meet on Thursday, but I posted your exam ones back on Canvas, so you should have a score, and you should have a PDF of your exam with handwritten grading comments on it, posted as a comment on that assignment in Canvas. So I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about that. First of all, I am sorry that it took me a little bit longer than usual to get that back to you. I try to get the exams back within a week, typically, but it was a little bit out of my hands this time, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. But overall, everybody as a class did very well. The average was an 89, almost a 90, I believe, and I'll show you some of the score distributions. Question number 12 had a mistake in it. I accidentally put reacting instead of responding, and so I didn't catch that before I posted the exam, and as I was grading through that, it definitely affected answers, and so everybody just received full credit for question 12 because the mistake in the question, it just wasn't a good question anymore. So I'm sorry about that. In terms of feedback, I think kind of the most noted thing is that it was longer. It took longer than some people expected, and I think, yeah, this is the longer of any of the exams you'll take. This first exam had to cover a lot of material, and it's typically not one that I do in a take-home format, so it had to be a little bit adapted for that. So I really do thank you for putting up with it being lengthy. The next two exams I've done in the past as take-homes, so they're a little more tailored to the time limit. And I also know that this is your first exam in this course, so it's kind of hard to judge, how long should you spend responding to a question. So I do want to encourage you that I think that the next 2 exams probably aren't as demanding in terms of time, and they're more applied. You can certainly put a lot of time and effort into them, but they're a little better contained. So just to give you an idea of the grading process and how I do that, so once all the exams are submitted, I take them and split them up by question. And so then I'll take like all of the question 1s and I'll grade all of question 1, then all of question 2. So I don't grade a single exam at a time. This is kind of a finding that's pretty reliable, that this is a good way to get consistency. And I grade it using the rubric that I posted on Canvas. So I should mention that. There are solutions and kind of the breakdown of points posted on Canvas in the file section for the exam. Sometimes, someone will interpret a question in a different way. I try my best in those cases to understand how it was interpreted and see how many points I can get you. I really do advocate to try to get you as the most credit you can get, and I'm not in the business of trying to count off points or anything. So there are some cases where the rubric doesn't necessarily apply, but in most cases that solutions guide and rubric is kind of the template that I used. So once I grade every question, I look at the stats on each question to see if there are problematic items. Is there anything that everyone did poorly on? Is there, which kind of would indicate a bad question or something that needed to be looked at. And then I take question by question all of the ones that did not receive a full credit and look at those for consistency. So I try to make sure that the standards are applied across every question and every exam as evenly as possible. And then I'll compute the overall scores from that. So for this exam, this is the distribution of scores. Let me jump out of there. So average was at 89.49, median score 91. You can see the most popular or most common score is 100. So people did well, and definitely I was impressed with a lot of the answers and enjoyed reading them. I've also included, and I'll post this with the slides, this is just the breakdown per question in case you're interested in the questions themselves. Please remember that question 12 was just credited to everybody because it was problematic. So, if you have any exam-related questions or problems, it could be as simple as sometimes I type in a score wrong or add something wrong. That definitely happens. If I've miscalculated a grade or something like that, let me know. If there's an item on the exam that you think was not graded in correspondence to the solutions that I posted. So if there's an item that you think you should have gotten more credit for, look at it, look at the solutions, and if it seems like that I made a mistake in grading it, let me know about that. And if you have clarifying or explanatory information, include that with your message. So you can send me an email, or you can use Canvas and send me a message. Just be sure to tell me what it is you want me to look at, and for any specific questions, if it's something you want me to look at rescoring the question, any explanation or clarifying information, go ahead and include that, and I'll will definitely, I'm more than willing to look at those and to fix anything that was graded incorrectly. So that brings us to a little bit of a kind of serious conversation that we have to have at this point. When you enroll as a student here, you agree to honor code. It's printed on a lot of things. It's in the syllabus. The exams and assignments in general tell you that your work needs to be your own, that if it's something that you're using from somewhere else, you need to provide references. If you're taking something verbatim, the exact words that someone else has written, they need to be in quotes, and you need to have a reference right next to them. If you're referencing material and you're summarizing it in your own words or making your own arguments using it, you should, provide a reference to what you read. But you don't need to put it in quotes if it's not exactly something. But I think we all know you can't just copy and paste things that you find on the internet and submit them as your work. I really don't know why you would do that. And honestly, if you get to a point where you've done that, just don't submit it. Just don't submit the thing that has the plagiarized work in it, or if it violates the honor code. It's, and I'm not talking about like a small thing, I'm not out there hunting for anything that might have similar words. But when a full assignment or exam is just a copy and paste of websites, I cannot ignore that. As a community, all of us, we value kind of this academic integrity, right? All of our degrees from this institution depend on that being, being the fact of the matter that people did honest work. So I know that the majority of the class, this is not a problem at all. And I don't want to bring us down too much about it, but I just really would like you to be mindful of it. When honor code things happen, that takes a lot of time away from that I can use to make better lectures and find more interesting things for you in class. It kind of takes away from the time I have to keep things up to date, because it's a lot of overhead to deal with those kinds of honor code violation cases. So just please stay on the safe side. If you have a question about anything, ask the question. If you use something from somewhere else and you're not sure, write it in there, cite it. Let's just not have to deal with any of these kinds of things occurring. So I really appreciate it, because it's rough. I know that sounds kind of silly, but from the instructor side, it's not pleasant at all, and it's not what I want to spend our time on. So just need to make that announcement for you. All right, so moving on. Wanted to have a little bit of a discussion about prototyping tool usage so far. So I took a look at what everybody submitted for their first prototyping checkpoint for your projects, and by far Adobe XD is the most popular, followed by Figma. And I've been reading the discussion boards for the reflection about the prototyping tools. So my intention is I was going to kind of find out what everyone's using, and then go and see also any problems you're having or any questions you have, and try to put together some focused resources for that. So I'll do that this week, and hopefully then I can help make those tools more useful to you, and provide you kind of good information in a quick way to help you improve your prototypes. I'm looking at everybody's prototypes, by the way, and they're really great. Everybody really did well, except for the 12 of you that didn't submit anything. So, if you haven't submitted your prototype, you really need to do that as soon as possible. We will have another checkpoint coming up next week. I'll talk about that on Thursday. It's nothing major. It's just more refinement of your existing prototype. But so there's a question about prototypes. Do you need to submit if your partner submitted for you? Yes. If you would please, everyone submit it. I know it'll be the same file. That's fine. And that helps me so that I don't have to track it down. So there's no, if you didn't, it's not a penalty or anything for doing that, but for my convenience, if you could submit, you could both, or everyone submit, that helps me. Also, if you're in a group, yeah, it's no problem, don't worry. In general, the whole project is about feedback and getting things done. So there's no real harsh penalties at this early phase as we get used to things. So also, if you're in a group though and you didn't submit the short paragraph about what each person did, please add that to your submission as well. So I should get you all feedback tomorrow on your prototypes, but they are all are looking really good. But if you haven't submitted one, please submit it as soon as possible. So prototype feedback is coming soon. Okay, so that sums up all of the logistical stuff that we needed to get through. So last time we were here, we talked about just a bunch of different interfaces, kind of a survey of a wide variety of interfaces, and I've got some of them here. Command interfaces, GUI interfaces, the whole landscape there. And we talked a little bit about which interface is appropriate depending on what kind of problem you're solving, and some of those factors. Today, we're going to talk about designing and conducting user studies, but I think a more appropriate title for the lecture we're going to have today and the next 3 lectures really would be evaluation. So we're going to be talking about the evaluation of interfaces and of systems and products, which is kind of the next phase. We've talked about creating these things, like an idea, and sketching and making a prototype, and kind of the natural thing that follows that is evaluation of your design. So for the next few lectures, today's lecture will kind of do an overview of this area. This is a huge area, so it's going to fill the next few lectures. On Thursday, we'll talk about actually designing evaluations for interfaces for systems that you build, and we'll focus on how you're going to do that for your project, your semester project. So part of the semester project is having your interface evaluated by potential users. So we'll discuss that in detail next time. And then the 2 lectures after that, we'll start to focus on how do you analyze the data that you collect during a study or a evaluation of an interface, and we'll spend one of those lectures focusing on presenting that data. So how do you visualize data, how do you make sense of it, and how do you convey your findings to others. So these are all really important aspects of designing systems. They're big parts of HCI and any kind of research done in HCI. And any kind of software development or hardware development where you have users and you want to cater to them. So let's kind of get started talking about evaluation in general. So like I mentioned, you imagine that you've gone through this whole process. You've found a problem space that you think you can create a technical solution for. You've kind of looked at the user's needs. You've made your design alternatives, you've sketched things, and you make your first prototype. So now you're kind of in a place where you need to know, is the thing that you've made, does it actually meet the needs that you designed it to meet? And then you also want to know, what's it like to use this thing? What's that user experience like? So we've talked about the difference between usability and user experience. We're interested in both of those when we evaluate something. And more importantly, we want to know, what can we do to make it better? So just kind of some definitions of the evaluation process, or just kind of some attributes of it. It's one of the most critical parts of design. Obviously, if you design something in a vacuum and you're the only person that ever looks at it, it's kind of, you don't know what other users would feel about it, or if it's actually useful to anyone except yourself. And so in evaluation, we're really focused on looking at the experiences and the ways that people interact with our systems, our prototypes, and gaining insight into that, both kind of on a level of usability, does it meet their needs, and on the level of user experience, how do they feel about using it? Because we want to look at both of those things and adapt our designs to kind of optimize for them. So here's a couple of kind of myths. These are pretty obvious, but the myth that if the design works well for you and people that it's going to work for everyone. If you enjoy using the thing that you made and other people enjoy using it, then you might think that would generalize. Kind of the reality is that people. So your users are people, right? And people are incredibly nuanced. So there are a lot of things, there are a lot of shared characteristics we have with each other, whether that's where we live or the language we speak, or how old we are, what time period we grew up in. There's just a ton of things that contribute to a user and who they are. And while there are enough shared characteristics that we can design for groups and general populations, we are really likely to miss things if we don't evaluate our prototypes and our systems with people from the groups that we expect to use it, and people who are not necessarily just like us or so close to us. So it's really, it's about taking the perspective of your user. And we've kind of, we've hammered that the whole way through this design process, right? In the very beginning, we're always thinking about the user. What are the user's needs? So this is an extension of that. We really care about how a user perceives the thing that we've made. So I do want to mention that evaluation is a huge topic, right? So when we talk about evaluation for a user interface or a system within human-computer interaction, we use a subset of evaluation techniques that are used all over the place, right? In all kinds of industries and domains. people gather data, they analyze data, and they make decisions based on it. And so these techniques are, the subject of many people's lives and careers. So we're only going to be able to touch the most important areas. We'll look at kind of what's the most useful, the most recent stuff in terms of HCI. And if there are areas as we're going through that you want more detail on, please let me know, and I'll focus in more on that. But I just want you to know that in general, there's a lot to this, and we're only going to kind of scrape the surface of it. If you want a couple of good resources related to HCI design and evaluating design, these two books that I've put here are both very good resources for doing that kind of thing. The first one, Measuring the User Experience, is kind of more broadly focused. It's very useful for any kind of design, product design. Whereas the second book, Research Methods, is more targeted towards doing like fundamental research on HCI. But of course, the evaluation methods are used across all kinds of systems. So those are two great resources if you want to go further on this kind of thing. So, like we've said, evaluation is part of the design process. It's kind of just this essential feedback mechanism, and it's focused both on the usability and the user experience. So I'm going to go through a few kind of questions about evaluation in general to kind of characterize some of the ways that we evaluate things. So, we've already talked quite a bit today about why we should evaluate a system, but to kind of summarize that, at the most basic level, you want to make sure that the thing you made does what it's supposed to do. You want to make sure the user's happy, that they're enjoying the experience. You want to find problems. So you can't think through every possible issue that might occur with a problem. And that's why you want to have a lot of different people try out a system. For example, my mom can break anything, any software, in a way that I could never imagine. And I'm sure we all know people who have that talent. So it really pays off in terms of finding just bugs or problems or misconceptions within your interface or your system. And that's really important. If you're making something that you want, to sell to the world, or you want people to adopt, it's the better product wins, right? So there's a big financial incentive in terms of when you're building systems that you're going to sell, in terms of conducting thorough evaluations. Evaluations can also be really helpful for your design process in terms of, yes, it helps you understand the user even more, but if you're working together with other people, evaluations are a great way to settle an argument between people who are designing an app or a product, right? Because sometimes there are several ways to do something, and opinions differ, and kind of the best way to settle that is to look at what users actually do and what their feedback is. So thinking about what we should evaluate. So you can choose your scope, right? You can do something broad where you're going to have someone, use the thing you've made kind of in a complete, comprehensive way, right? Like they're going to complete whatever task it was made for and evaluate it throughout that. Or you could focus in very narrowly on a specific feature, maybe. Maybe you're just wanting to optimize the way a menu works in software or something, right? You could conduct evaluations just on the menu navigation. And it just depends on where you are in your design process, kind of on experience is misspelled in that slide. I will fix that. So it depends on, what the user needs are, where you are in your design process, and kind of what your goals are, right? As to what you're going to evaluate. So for the most part, you won't evaluate every little detail of every system, thoroughly, right? You will probably do some kind of broad, evaluation, and then maybe a couple of focused ones, and then further broad evaluations. So in terms of, where do you actually conduct an evaluation? So it can depend a lot, obviously, on the system that you're designing, but in general, we kind of break it down into 3 categories. So the first category is a controlled environment. So this would be things like lab studies and experiments. Also, though, if you bring in a focus group, right? Say you have your prototype and you bring in a group of 5 or 6 people, and they're going to sit in a room together and maybe play with the prototype, and you're going to sit there and ask them questions, and they're going to tell you how they feel, that kind of thing. It's still a controlled environment, but that they're conducting the evaluation in. On the other hand, we can do things in more natural settings. So that would be where we take the product or the system and we put it where it's going to live once it's an actual product. So wherever it's going to be used, we put it there, and then we make observations about its use. And there are a lot of ways we can go about doing that. And in that way, we get the benefit of seeing it in context, where it's going to be used. Because when you bring people into the lab, it can be difficult for a wide variety of reasons that we'll discuss to help them forget they're in a lab, and to get rid of any of the effects of that. So, trying your prototypes in a natural setting when you can is often a good choice. Now, kind of the third odd category that I have to mention is that you can do evaluations without any users. So there are a couple of ways to do that, and we'll talk about those in detail in a couple of slides. So, in terms of when do you do the evaluation? So, I think it should be pretty clear that in general, you don't just do one evaluation, right? You'll do several throughout the design of a product. I will break things down a little bit for you as how it works in industry, in a commercial business, versus in the academic world, which is more kind of research grants and that kind of thing. There are a lot of similarities, but there are some distinctions. So in industry, obviously, prior to product development, you will do evaluations of kind of how you understand the problem space, and you'll do it at various phases, of like your prototyping as you go. And even once you have a product that's launched in the world, you'll typically do some type of ongoing evaluation of the product, and we'll talk about ways of doing that too. In the academic world, so we typically our evaluations are driven by investigations of particular research areas, more so than products. Which is very similar, right? Because a research area is solving a problem, usually it's kind of it's kind of similar to, just a problem space where you might make a product. But in general, the academic world will kind of focus more on the research area itself and let that decide when evaluations should take place and kind of how they should take place. So there are two important types of evaluation as well. You'll see these mentioned probably in literature if you read anything about evaluations of interfaces or products. So there's what we call a formative evaluation and a summative evaluation. And it's a pretty simple distinction. Formative evaluations occur during the design process. Typically it's a new product or a new solution. The whole point of a formative evaluation is to inform the design process. It's, you're wanting feedback to help you change things, to make things better, to create new design alternatives, to narrow things down. You'll have a wide range of prototype fidelities used when you're doing formative evaluations. They might be very rough. And you'll be more flexible about who can give you feedback and how rigorous you need to be in your methods in terms of collecting data and setting up studies. So because you're using it to inform design, it's a little more flexible. On the other hand, a summative evaluation is typically done once a product is completely finished, and it can be used to kind of measure the performance of a product. It can definitely be used to compare products, competing products that do the same thing. In general, when you do this kind of evaluation, it's more rigid. You care a lot more about making sure you test it on the right user group with the right number of users. You want to conduct formal analysis, so you need to worry about biases and things like that. So it's a little more controlled, and it's not directly plugged into the design process. So those are just kind of a way to break it into two distinct time periods. Now, obviously, these are not the only two, right? There are things that kind of drift between them, but this is a good. These are good anchor points to think about. So let's talk about a little bit more about the types of evaluation. So how do you evaluate, right? So we mentioned that it's possible to do evaluation without any users. And so this is a type of evaluation that commonly is called like expert review, or it might fall under the category of modeling. Some of the specific approaches include, things that are called inspections or walkthroughs, heuristic analysis. And the idea here is that someone who is experienced in designing the type of product that you're designing will take the design and they'll evaluate it on their own without bringing in any users. And a lot of times what they'll do is they'll apply kind of general design rules and heuristics that are known to evaluate it. In the case of doing like a walkthrough, they might think through the process of how the user will accomplish a task, and they'll evaluate the interface or the product that way. You can also do some modeling, so you can apply known behaviors that users have. For example, we talked about Fitts law, which kind of dictates or describes the relationship of how people target things with a pointer, right, on a screen. So you could look at an interface and apply kind of our knowledge of that model to it to say, it's going to be roughly this efficient in comparison to, laying it out this way. And that didn't require any users, but it does depend on your models. It depends on your heuristics. Next time we'll talk about some of the kind of well-known heuristics and design checklists that exist for interfaces. but they're not perfect, and they miss things. So that's kind of what's important to remember there. You can evaluate something without other users, but you're almost guaranteed to miss things. So in comparison to like just an expert reviewing a prototype or a design, we can also do passive observation without really needing to ask much of users. And this is typically done in existing products that are regularly updated. So today we have lots of ways of collecting data about how people are using software. We'll talk about the ethics of that a little bit later, but in general, most modern software systems tend to collect some data about how they're being used, whether it's something as simple as a crash report when something bad happens, or more invasive things about when does a user click on this or that, and that data can be analyzed without actually having to discuss with the user very much the fact that they're going to be evaluating this thing. And we can just look at the analytics of things, and more we can look at sensor data because people have lots of hardware that senses lots of different things with them, and this can be really useful. And kind of when we talk about this in detail, we'll really touch on the ethics of this, because it's important that users understand that you're collecting data about what they're doing, and that tends to be an area that is not always respected or thought about, but it's very important. But this is a great tool because you don't put yourself into the equation too much, right? It's not like somebody's in a lab, and it's not like you're a researcher in their domain where you usually aren't. So you don't affect them when you do this. But there are limits to the fidelity of the data you can get, and there are obviously just kind of these ethical limits, and just the practical aspect of if you want to do this passive observation, you have to already have a pretty robust system or product that you can put out in the world, and it's being used. So that's why it tends to be on systems that are already developed, and that they're just adding new features or fine-tuning things, not so much on brand new designs. Kind of the next category of evaluation style is an ethnography. And this is kind of straight out of social science and anthropology. It's the idea being that you, as a designer of a system or a researcher, you go and you bring your system, your prototype, to the users that would use it, and you kind of integrate among them, live with them, and observe them using your system. And you might take notes about, kind of how it's used and what you think could be improved. But kind of the thing here is that it's really resource intensive, it's time intensive, and also you can't get around the fact that you're there. And so you have to consider that. It's usually fine, and as long as you're conscious of the fact that your presence has an influence, the evaluation method is solid still. So that's one way of kind of being out in the world with your product and evaluating it. Also related to that is what you would call field studies. So if you develop something that's more for a specific field, and I'll show you some examples of this, you might go out with that group of people to their job site or in their office or wherever they're using your product, and watch them use it or have them perform some task, and you collect some data. Focus groups, we talked about that, people coming in and talking about your system. And then kind of on the other end of everything is controlled experiments, where you really tightly control all of the variables and you vary very specific things and look at the outcomes of doing that. And we'll talk in detail about that as well. So I've got some slides here that are just kind of going through some of that detail that I just discussed. So I won't spend too long on them. They're mainly here so that you have them when I post them. But expert review, we talked about using heuristics to evaluate, doing walkthroughs, passive observations or analytics. So the great thing here, we talked about no researcher, but also the problem here, ethically challenging, and you need a pretty reliable system to be able to put it out there. Ethnographies, so these are what we just discussed. I should also note, I don't think I said this, they're really great for that initial need finding. So if you're just looking at a problem space, going to be with the people that exist in that space that you're going to design something for, is a really useful thing. Okay, so I want to give you an example of kind of a pseudo field study. Can I explain? There's a question. Could I explain ethnographies again? Is it just an academic study? So an ethnography in general is that you as a designer or a researcher are going to go and, in the traditional sense, go and live with a group of people or that you are learning about. So kind of traditional ethnography, there's the book Coming of Age in Samoa by Margaret Mead, I think. It's kind of the classic ethnography. And so in that sense, in that case, she went and lived in Samoa and learned about life in Samoa and captured detailed notes and presented that. And so it's kind of that concept. Kind of like Meetup. I don't know what maybe. I'm not familiar with the term Meetup. But it's definitely it's about getting to know the user. And when you do an evaluation, it's about bringing your thing into that environment and seeing how it goes. So yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so field studies. So this is where you go with a specific group and look at something in their domain in the field. So I'm going to show you some examples of some of the work that the STARS lab that I'm part of at Mississippi State does with the local law enforcement SWAT team. So in this case, it's not so much a field study because we, for the most part, don't go with them like when they're actually, performing their law enforcement job out in general public. But what we do is we work with them when they're training for those situations. And the reason for that is, is one of safety, honestly, and that constrains a lot of studies. But in our case, we're a robotics lab, and so we do, kind of these monthly trainings, which SWAT teams, if you're unfamiliar, they train regularly so that they know, what to do whenever they have to go and perform their law enforcement duties. So typically they have training venues. This is an example of one, and it's a space that allows them to practice moving through the kind of environments they would move through whenever they're doing their law enforcement duties. You can kind of see here's an above view. I should say that this is designed for them, because it's law enforcement, to be able to use simulated ammunition. So they use non-lethal rounds in their weapons, and they're able to actually kind of fully simulate what they would do in a real situation that they're called to. And what we do is we work with them at these trainings with the different pieces of technology that we're researching for them to use, robots usually. We also have some custom built environments for very specific things on campus. This is a picture of a reconfigurable space that we have. It gets used for lots of things, but it can be configured to study very specific things that they might encounter. And you can see it's got a rail system to mount lighting and to simulate all kinds of conditions. And here you see a picture of this is a door that is a breaching door to practice kicking through, and they'll practice this with actual people playing the role of either hostages or offenders, people that they need to get to. So I'll see if I'll show you a video of one of these. Let's see. Okay, so yeah, that's actually a place on campus. It's over at Cavs. So that example is showing kind of how they would clear an area without the technology. And in this example, you'll see they're using the robot in a similar scenario. So I'll play this one. Okay, so you can see in that one, they're using the robot as a look-ahead technology, and so this is not obviously in an actual response, but it's in their actual training environment, and so this is really useful to see how this is going to work, because obviously it's kind of high stakes if you integrate something and it doesn't work. It can cause some problems. Let's see. So I think I have another video that kind of gives you a fuller picture.
You got one right there.
Okay, so in that case, what you saw was that was focused on their use of the interface for the robot that's ahead of them. So you saw they were using a Wii nunchuck controller to drive it. They also had an interface on their arm, and so in that particular set of studies, it was about are they hiring any gamers to control those drones? I don't know. Possibly. So a lot of that work is, looking at different interfaces, looking at how that integrates with their tactics and that kind of thing. And so, it's really important to actually be in that environment with them. On the other hand, another example is a focus group, right? And this is also something that we do in our lab. Oddly enough, we do both law enforcement research and therapy related research. So in this case, you can see this is our Therabot robotic dog that I've mentioned before. One of the kind of studies that we do frequently with something like this is to bring in people, and a lot of times it's students, and we'll give them a prototype, physical version of the robot, and we'll, talk to them kind of in a guided interview fashion, get their thoughts on it, what they, think it should do, what it doesn't do well, and gather insights that way. So that's kind of an example of a focus group approach to doing something like this. And we might also do things like we'll have one version of Therabot that's the full robotic version, and we'll have another one that's just a stuffed animal, and we'll let them compare and manipulate them to see, are there things that the robot's constraining that they would want to do with it that they can't. So that's again, it's kind of it's not super controlled. We're not studying any one specific thing about this system necessarily, and we're kind of using a broad group of users or potential users, but we're trying to get insights into the basic design process, right? And I'll show you some examples using Therabot also in controlled studies. We'll talk about that more on Thursday, but so that you can kind of see the distinction between the two. So controlled experiments, they're more useful for looking at a very specific element of a system. In a controlled experiment, you really want to eliminate all the variables except one, and you want to control that variable and see what happens when you change it. So that's a really hard thing to do sometimes, and designing good controlled experiments is critically important. If you have problems in the design of your experiments, you're going to have problems with what you find. You may not find anything because of the problems, but you may find something that's not actually there if you're not careful. And so there's a lot to think about when you're doing controlled experiments, and we'll discuss that in detail. So one example that I've shared with you a couple of times is some of the work that we do in our lab with children and robots, and specifically, using the robots to conduct forensic interviews with them. So something that a social worker would usually do with a child, talk to them about some traumatic experience or a crime that they witnessed. And we do that in a very controlled setting, because in our case, what we want to vary is the person or robot asking the child questions, interviewing the child, right? So we want to try it with either a human or a robot, but we also care about what if we use a interviewer that is male for a child that is male versus a child that's female. What about the robot having a gender? So if we have a female robot versus a male robot, or what if we try to make the robot gender neutral? So those are all really specific things, and so it requires a lot of control across everything else, because you really only want to know what the effect of changing that one thing is. So here I've got just a picture, a floor plan of the environment that we do this in, and you can see that it's kind of the, I guess, the fact that this exists, this drawing exists to the level that it does, should tell you what you need to know about controlled experiments. Everything has to be very well documented. It has to be the same every time. Consistency is incredibly important. And so in this case, one of the interesting things is when you ask people to evaluate a system, right? Like if I brought you in and I showed you a robot that I built and I asked you, questions about it, you are probably going to be nice to me for the most part, even if it's horrible. You'll probably find some positive things to say, because in general it's unpleasant to tell someone that the thing they made is bad. If you notice in this diagram, there are two separate rooms, one called a research room and one an interview room, because we need to try to get an unbiased assessment of the person that interviews, or the robot that interviews the child. We actually, when they come into a study, they get paired with a separate person, a researcher, who's kind of their friend throughout the whole study. And when we ask them questions about their experience, with the robot or the human interviewer, we do it in a separate room with that person that's their guide through the study. That person never goes in with them into the interview experience. So it's very separated. And it's an attempt to control for some of that effect, where people, and especially kids, will try to say the thing that they think you want to hear, rather than maybe what they really feel or experience. And we'll talk next time about specifically how to measure things and how you can kind of combat the biases that you get when people self-report something, different ways to measure things to deal with that. But that's a huge area. So just to give you a little more context, this is that research room where they, conduct any evaluations and talk, about their experience with the researcher. Whereas this is the room where they're actually interviewed by the robot or human. And I know I've shown you these photos before. You can see that some of the details are incredibly important. So this is a photo in the early construction of this environment for this study. And you notice that all of the furniture here is marked exactly where it's set. And that's because after this photo was taken, we finished building out everything. We test it with people on our team to make sure that eye contact's right, that when you look here, everything's right. And then all of that gets, recorded and anchored down. We have the exact coordinates of where every piece of furniture goes, where every sensor mounts. And we have to make sure those things every day when we come in to run a new set of studies, that everything is where it's supposed to be. Because even the slightest details can cause you a lot of trouble later if they're not kept consistent. So that's kind of, I guess, to give you a feel of the high amount of scrutiny that can go into a controlled study. And I should say, not all studies are as demanding. This study happens to be quite involved because it's looking at a detailed area. It's looking at a free-form interaction with a robot, and it's with children, which is another thing that we will talk about, is the kind of the ethics of people evaluating your product. In a lot of cases, there are questions about that, especially when your product is, or your thing that you're studying is dealing with children in vulnerable situations. And that's just a picture of kind of the control room. So that we've seen that before. So we'll talk more next lecture about who participates in your evaluation. The short answer is that you always want a representative sample of your target user group, but that can be a little bit more complicated. I also want to mention, we'll talk about some of the terminology more next time, and you'll hear several different terms. So you'll hear studies, evaluations, you'll kind of hear user study, experiment, field study. We'll get kind of sort those terms out all together next time. But I want to mention this distinction here between a usability evaluation and a user study. So a usability evaluation you can kind of think of more as an informal examination of a prototype or a system. You're focused on seeing how well something performs, but you might not need a rigorous approach. You might be able to ask a few people a few people that work with you. You could kind of sample without worrying too much about controlling the environment strictly. You're just trying to get a sense about the usability of something and kind of use that to inform your design. On the other hand, a user study is much more controlled typically. Usually it's an experimental design, so that is requires a high level of control on everything and a variable that you isolate and manipulate. And typically user studies are going to be used in a way that we want to be able to statistically analyze them in a sound way. So in a couple of lectures we'll talk about basic statistics and how that works in terms of user evaluations. But in general, when we consider something at the level of a formal user study, we're going to care a lot more about those getting those things right, being rigorous, because we're probably going to be distributing these results or publishing them somewhere. And we want them to be useful for other people. So I'll give you a quick example. This is the Smart Nightlight, the little sample app that we've talked about a few times. A quick usability evaluation example here might be if I gave the user a prototype version of this, and I just wanted to see if they're able to accomplish some task, right? Are they able to turn the light on or off? Can they change it to a color of their choosing? That's kind of a quick, simple evaluation. Whereas a more experimental approach, a more experimental question might be, I have these two versions of the interface, slightly different, right? And I want to compare the difference in the amount of time it takes them to adjust the brightness of a light. And so that's more of an experimental design, right? I'm isolating this one feature, and I'm going to ultimately measure the amount of time for people that use one and people that use the other, and I'm going to compare them statistically. So, okay, so to kind of bring this into terms of the differences between the academic world and industry, and these are generalizations, but in the academic world, so in research done in HCI labs, like in universities, typically that work's focused on furthering our understanding of some fundamental concept, some technology and how it could be used. It's not so much concerned with a particular device or very specific product. So we, the academic world focuses more on the rigor of the methods, the procedures, and kind of the evaluations that are done in academic settings are about developing a set of knowledge that is able to be published and able to be replicated and used by others to continue either looking at that line of study or to be used by someone building a product. And this isn't a hard and fast rule. Just in general, the academic world tries to look at broader things, tries to look at understanding concepts and processes. In industry, for the most part, you're more focused on a tangible, practical product that solves a specific problem. Again, not always the case, right? There's lots of R&D that's done to generate ideas for new products, but there is a lot of evaluation done in commercial industry that's focused on making something that someone wants to buy that's useful to them. And you do find rigorous approaches, but a lot of times the more important thing is that the product is good and is something that people want and it's useful. And you don't always publish what you find, right? It might be bad for you to share some of that. So there's a difference there. And luckily in computing and HCI in general, we find that a lot of people in industry are also very plugged into research and very willing to share a lot of things. We're fortunate that kind of, for the most part, there are a lot of major tech companies and that still kind of believe in or encourage sharing and disseminating information, and like libraries and stuff. So we'll talk about kind of the impact of evaluation more next time. So I'm going to skip ahead. I'll share some of these findings with you next time about some of the examples that I showed. And next time we'll talk more about designing evaluations. How do you do that? How do you measure things? What are your choices there? And how do you get something useful out of an evaluation? So in terms of action items, I will post a quiz tomorrow, and that will be due before class on Thursday. On Thursday, we'll talk more about what's next for your projects. If you have time to work on your projects more, keep refining your prototype. That is what's next for your project. So continue to work on that. Take note of any challenges that you encounter, so we can talk about solving those. And next time we'll talk more about designing studies. So that's everything I have today. Are there any questions before we wrap up? Okay, well, then that is everything for me. So I will see everyone on WebEx on Thursday.